The cook noticed it before anybody else did. His name was Walter Bemis, a mess sergeant from Eau Claire who had spent 11 years feeding men who complained about his food, and he knew the sound a full mess hall was supposed to make. Trays scraping, benches dragging, 200 voices arguing about nothing. That was the noise of men eating, and he had heard it every day of his adult life. On this particular evening in the winter of 1944, at a camp buried in the frozen middle of Wisconsin, he stood behind a steam counter and heard almost nothing at all. The men in front of him were not eating. They were looking down at their trays with an expression he could not place. One of them, a boy who could not have been 20, was holding his spoon in a closed fist against the table, and his shoulders were shaking. Further along the line, an older man had set his tray down without touching it, straightened his back, and closed his eyes like someone waiting for a door to open. Bemis turned to the soldier next to him and asked what was wrong with the food. Nothing was wrong with the food. That was the problem. The food was perfect. He had served them white rice, steamed and glistening and heaped generously, the best rice the United States Army could buy, and every man who had taken a portion believed he had just been handed the last meal he would ever eat. To understand how a bowl of rice could do that, you have to understand what those men had been told about the country they were now standing in. And you have to understand what they had been told about themselves. Camp McCoy sat in Monroe County, Wisconsin, about halfway between Sparta and Tomah, on 60,000 acres of sand ridges, scrub oak, and marsh. In summer it was a decent enough place. In winter it was something else. The wind came across the open ground with nothing to slow it down, and the cold settled into the low spots and stayed there for months. Local men who worked construction on the base said you could tell a newcomer because he wore his coat buttoned. The veterans wore theirs closed with wire. It was, by any measure, the single strangest place on the face of the earth to put a group of men captured in the tropics. And yet that is exactly what the War Department did. Starting in 1942, prisoners taken in the Pacific began arriving in Wisconsin. Not many at first. A handful. Then a few dozen. Men pulled unconscious out of the surf. Men found delirious in the jungle. Men fished out of the water after their ships went down and revived on American decks before they could finish what they had intended to do to themselves. That last detail matters more than anything else in this story, so I want to slow down on it. Almost none of these men surrendered. In January 1941, the Japanese War Ministry issued a short document called the Senjin-kun, the Field Service Code, distributed down to the level of the individual soldier. It covered discipline, conduct, and the obligations of a fighting man, and it contained one line that would end up shaping the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. It instructed the soldier never to live to suffer the disgrace of being taken captive. That was not a suggestion. It was not read as one, anyway. It was drilled into recruits, repeated by officers, printed in newspapers, and folded into the ordinary vocabulary of the war until it stopped being a policy and became a fact about the world, the way gravity is a fact about the world. To be taken prisoner was not a misfortune. It was the end of you as a person. Your name would be struck from the family register in spirit, if not in ink. Your parents would be visited by neighbors who would not know what to say. Your wife would be, in the eyes of everyone around her, something worse than a widow. So the men who ended up in Wisconsin had not walked out of the trees with their hands up. They had been robbed of the chance to do otherwise. They had been knocked out by concussion, or pinned under wreckage, or found with wounds that had already put them past the point of deciding anything for themselves. Look at Attu, in the Aleutians, in May of 1943. A Japanese garrison of roughly 2,600 men defended that island. When it was over, after the last charge came out of the fog and broke against the American line, 28 prisoners were taken. 28 out of 2,600. That was not a battle in any sense an American infantrymen would have recognized. It was a mass act of self-erasure with a battle happening around it. The men who survived that arithmetic went into American custody with a very specific problem. They were not supposed to exist. Which brings me to the names. I'm going to tell you this story through a few men in particular, and I want to be honest with you about something first. A great many Japanese prisoners in American hands gave false names, not out of tactical cleverness, out of shame. If the International Red Cross forwarded a prisoner list to Tokyo and your real name was on it, your family learned you were alive, and in the world they were living in, that news would land like a death notice with an insult attached. So men invented names. They gave the names of dead comrades, of childhood friends, of characters out of books. Some gave a plausible name and stuck with it for 3 years without a slip. Which means that the paperwork from these camps, in a lot of cases, records a man who never lived. Hold on to that. We will come back to it. Call the older man Tsuneo Arakawa. He was a sergeant major, 38 years old, from a town north of Sendai, and he had been on Atu. A mortar fragment had opened his thigh and taken most of the blood out of him, and he had been carried off that island by 2 American medics who had no idea they were doing him what he considered the worst turn of his life. Call the young one Kenzo Muraoka. 19. A fisherman's son from the Izu coast, a boiler room raiding on a destroyer that came apart under air attack, thrown clear by the blast and picked up 9 hours later by an American ship because he had been too stunned to let go of the piece of decking that was keeping him alive. They came into Camp McCoy on a train, in the dark, in February. Nobody had told them where they were going. That was standard. A prisoner in transit learned his destination when the doors opened. What they knew was that they had spent days crossing an enormous country and that the country did not end. That was the thing several of them wrote about later, in memoirs and interviews and testimony. Not the guards, not the food, the size. Japan is a country where you are never far from either a mountain or the sea. These men watched flat, planted, fenced, unbombed farmland go by for a day and a half, and every mile of it was quietly demolishing something they had been assured about the enemy's weakness. Then the farmland turned white, and kept turning whiter, and the windows frosted over on the inside of the car. Muraoka had never seen snow like it. He had seen snow. He had not seen a landscape that had been erased by it. When the train stopped and the doors came open, the cold went into the car like something with a physical shape, and men who had been captured in the Solomons in cotton uniforms started shaking so hard they could not hold their kit. The temperature on the platform that morning was somewhere below 0. Not below freezing, below 0. Arakawa got down onto the platform and did what a sergeant major does, which is to count his men and look at the enemy. The wire was high and doubled. There were towers, and the towers were manned. There were weapons. All of that was as expected. What was not as expected was the way the guards were standing. He had prepared himself, on the ship and on the train, for the faces of men who had permission to hate him. He had constructed those faces in his mind in some detail. What he saw instead were young Americans hunched into their collars, stamping their boots, looking at a line of half-frozen prisoners in tropical clothing, with an expression he eventually identified, to his considerable discomfort, as embarrassment. As though they were ashamed to be handing over a country this cold to men who had not brought the right clothes. Somebody shouted an order. The prisoners were marched through the gate, and inside a heated building, laid out on tables, were wool overcoats, gloves, wool socks, and boots. Muraoka told an interviewer, decades afterward, that this was the first moment he was truly afraid. Not on the ship, not on the platform. Here, in a warm room, being handed a coat, because he had been taught what the Americans did with prisoners. It was not a vague rumor. It was specific. Prisoners were tortured for information, then worked in mines until they died, and the ones who were no longer useful were killed and buried where nobody would look. That was not whispered in barracks. It was official. It was one of the reasons the man beside you would blow himself up rather than raise his hands. And now they were giving him a coat. There is no honest way to make sense of that if the thing you have been told is true. So the mind does the only thing left to it. It decides the kindness is a technique. They are warming us up so the interrogation goes better. They are fattening us for something. Whatever this is, it is the beginning of a process, and we have not seen the end of the process yet. Arakawa went down the line of his men and told them exactly that. Take the coat. Wear the coat. Do not believe the coat. The barracks were long wooden buildings with coal stoves at each end, the same buildings American soldiers lived in on the other side of the wire, built from the same plans by the same contractors in the same rush. Bunks, blankets, a stove that had to be fed at night. The men crowded around the stoves and could not stop touching them. Somebody laughed and then stopped himself, because laughing seemed like a mistake. Then they were told there would be a meal. They lined up. They filed in. And here is where I need you to slow down with me, because everything in this story turns on the next 4 minutes. The mess hall was hot and lit and smelled of steam. Down the counter, American soldiers stood behind insulated containers, and the men in the line could smell what was in them before they could see it. Rice. Not the smell of rice as those men had come to know it in the previous 2 years. In the field, rice had been an idea more than a food. It came mixed with barley to stretch it. It came with millet, with soy, with sweet potato, with whatever a supply officer could find when the ships stopped arriving. On the islands, toward the end, men had eaten it as a thin gruel measured out by the cup, and then measured out by the half cup, and then not measured out at all. And at home it was no better. Rice had been rationed in Japan since 1941. Households received an allowance, and the allowance shrank, and what arrived in the allowance was increasingly not rice. Mothers stretched it with barley and radish and sweet potato vine. Pure polished white rice, the good stuff, plain in quantity, had quietly become something most families in Japan simply did not eat anymore. That is what was steaming behind the counter. Polished white rice, cooked properly, in a quantity that suggested nobody had counted it. Arakawa held out his tray, and an American with a ladle put a mound of it in front of him. Then vegetables. Then meat, actual meat, in gravy. The soldier said something in English and gestured at the mound with his ladle, and the gesture obviously meant more, and Arakawa did not understand any of it except the gesture, which was the worst part. He walked to the table with his tray, and he did not sit down. Behind him in the line, the same thing was happening to man after man, a little wave of stillness moving backward from the counter as each of them worked it out. In Japan, condemned men are fed. That is the tradition. The night before an execution, the man in the cell is given a proper meal, a good meal, better than anything he has eaten in captivity. White rice, fish, sometimes sekihan, the red rice with beans that is served at weddings and births, and the great turning points of a life. It is not a reward. It is a courtesy extended to someone who is about to cross over, a way of saying that whatever he has done, the crossing itself deserves respect. Every man in that room knew it. It was not obscure. It was the kind of cultural knowledge you absorb from stories and films and the way adults talk, the same way an American child learns what a last cigarette means without anybody explaining it. So look at what those men were holding. White rice, in quantity, served by an enemy who had every reason to kill them, in a country whose language they did not speak, in a camp surrounded by wire, at the end of a journey nobody had explained to them. The evidence was not ambiguous. Given everything they believed about the Americans, it was the only interpretation that fit. Somebody said it out loud. Later accounts disagree on who. A voice from the middle of the room said the words for last meal, and after that the room understood itself. What happened next is the part that has stayed with me longest, and it is the reason I think this story is worth 6,000 words of your evening. Nobody screamed. Nobody rushed the door. There was no scene. They sat down. Some of them prayed. Some sat with their hands flat on the table on either side of the tray, looking straight ahead. One man asked quietly whether anyone had paper, because he wanted to write a jisei, a death poem, which is what a Japanese man of that generation composed when he knew the hour and wanted to leave something shaped behind him. 2 or 3 men began to eat with great deliberation, because it had been given to them, and refusing it would be a discourtesy, and they had decided that whatever else happened, they were going to be correct. Muraoka, 19 years old, ate his rice and cried without making any noise at all, and told himself the same sentence over and over, which was that his mother would never find out about any of this. Not the capture, not the camp, not the end of it. She would be told he was killed at sea, which was true enough, and she would be able to keep him. Arakawa did what he had been doing since he woke up in an American field hospital, which was to hold the thing together. He stood up. He told them that they had all understood for a long time that this was possible, that they would take it as men, and that no one in this room would give the enemy the satisfaction of seeing a Japanese soldier come apart over a bowl of rice. Then he sat down and ate his last meal, and thought about his wife, and the small daughter who would be 8 now, and the fact that neither of them would ever know where in the world he had gone. On the other side of the counter, Sergeant Walter Bemis was watching 200 men eat his food in total silence, while some of them wept into it, and he was, by his own account many years later, completely at a loss. He grabbed the first officer he could find. The officer grabbed the interpreter. The interpreter's name, for our purposes, was Masao Shiraishi, and I want to stop the story here for a moment, because the American standing in that mess hall was carrying more of this than anyone else in the building. Shiraishi was a staff sergeant in the United States Army. He was born in California. He was as American as Bemis was, and he spoke Japanese because his parents spoke Japanese, and the Army had discovered in 1942 that this made him one of the most valuable men in uniform. Japanese language specialists were desperately scarce. Nisei soldiers, second-generation Japanese Americans, ended up doing that work at every level, translating documents, interrogating prisoners, standing in rooms exactly like this one. And while he did it, his mother and his younger sisters were living behind wire in a relocation center in Wyoming, because their country had decided that people who looked like them could not be trusted near the coast. He never mentioned it to the prisoners, not once in the whole time he worked there. He said later that it would have been impossible to explain, and worse to try. So the American officer asked him what was wrong with the prisoners, and Shiraishi went over to the nearest table and asked, in the polite form, and a man answered him without looking up. "We are ready. We would like to know when." It took him a moment to be sure he had understood. When he had it, he went and stood at the front of that mess hall, next to a captain named Elmer Dahlgren who was about to have the most confusing 5 minutes of his military career, and he explained. Dahlgren asked him to say it again. Shiraishi said it again. "They think the rice is a last meal. They think they are being executed tonight." The captain looked out at 200 men sitting at attention over their dinners, and then he looked at the steam trays, and then he said the sentence that Shiraishi translated for the room, and it is not an elegant sentence, and I think that is exactly why it worked. He said, "This is Tuesday." Then he said the rest of it. "Nobody is going to be executed. Nobody here has the authority to execute you, and nobody wants it. The rice is dinner. You will have rice tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day you are here. Because the rules we operate under say that prisoners eat what our own soldiers eat, and the army buys rice for you because you are Japanese, and that is what the regulation was interpreted to mean." Then he told Shiraishi to add one more thing, which was that if the portions were not enough, they should say so, because there was more. Nothing happened. That is the part people get wrong when they tell this story. They imagine relief breaking over the room like a wave. It did not. 200 men who had spent an hour preparing to die were now being told by the enemy, through a man whose face looked like theirs and whose uniform did not, that they had misread a plate of food. Nobody believed him. Why would they? An announcement is just words, and they had a great many words in their heads already, and those words came from officers they had trusted for years. A single American captain standing next to a steam tray was not going to outweigh that. Several of the prisoners concluded that the execution had simply been postponed. A few decided the whole speech was a piece of cruelty, a way of taking away the composure they had spent an hour assembling. Arakawa's private judgment, which he gave in an interview in the 1980s, was blunter. He thought the American was lying, and he thought the lie meant the interrogations were about to start, and he went back to his bunk that night and prepared himself for the second thing, having survived the first. The belief did not break that evening. It could not have. It was not built out of an evening. What broke it was breakfast. There was rice at breakfast. There was rice at lunch. There was rice at dinner. And the following morning there was rice again. And this went on with a stupid, plodding, bureaucratic regularity that no propaganda in the world could have argued with. Men who had prepared to die on a Tuesday found themselves, by the following Sunday, complaining mildly about the quality of the pickles. That is how a belief actually dies. Not in a flash of insight. In a slow, grinding accumulation of ordinary mornings that refuse to match the story you were given. And I think the most remarkable thing about the whole affair is the reason the rice was there in the first place, which had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with a filing cabinet. In 1929, in Geneva, a convention was signed governing the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States ratified it. Japan signed it and then never ratified it, which is a distinction that would cost an enormous number of Allied lives. Buried in that document is Article 11, and Article 11 says that the food ration of prisoners of war shall be equal in quantity and quality to that of the troops at base camps. Read that again, and notice what it does not say. It does not say prisoners shall be fed adequately. It does not say humanely, or sufficiently, or according to local custom. It sets a benchmark, and the benchmark is your own soldiers. Whatever you give them, you give these men. Somewhere in the American supply system, a staff officer had to turn that sentence into a purchase order. And when he sat down to do it, he ran into a question that had no obvious answer. If the standard is what our own troops eat, and our own troops are being fed by a quartermaster corps that buys food by nationality and preference, then what exactly do we buy for Japanese prisoners? The answer they arrived at was rice, polished white rice, in bulk, along with soy sauce, tea, and, where it could be sourced, fish. Not because anybody in the War Department felt tenderly toward the men in Wisconsin. Because a clerk with a regulation and a form worked out that this was what the regulation required, and then requisitioned it, and then a truck brought it, and then it kept coming, because that is what supply systems do once they have started. The kindness that broke those men was not a decision. It was a procurement contract. I find that far more moving than the version where a warm-hearted commandant decides to be generous, and I will tell you why. Generosity can be withdrawn. A man in a good mood is a man who will one day be in a bad one. But a system that has been instructed to feed you the way it feeds its own, and that will go on doing it through winter, through casualty reports, through news of atrocities in the Pacific that made every American in that camp furious, is a different kind of promise. It does not depend on anybody liking you, and they did not particularly like them. That should be said. Camp McCoy was staffed by ordinary Americans, some of whom had brothers in the Pacific, and the news that came back from those islands was not the kind of news that inclines a man to charity. What the guards had instead of goodwill was a rule, and an army's habit of following rules, and it turned out that this was enough. Once the prisoners accepted that they were going to keep waking up, the camp had to work out what to do with them, and the answer was work. They cut timber. They worked the camp farm and the vegetable plots. They laid drainage, repaired buildings, worked in the laundries and the kitchens. Under the same convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, officers could not, and the work could not be connected to the operations of war. They were paid 80 cents a day, credited in canteen scrip, and with the scrip they bought cigarettes, soap, writing paper, candy, and eventually musical instruments. There is a photograph in my head that I cannot verify, but that I am fairly sure existed somewhere in Wisconsin in 1944. of a man who had been on Attu standing in a canteen line, trying to work out how many packs of cigarettes he could afford, in a country he had been told would starve him to death for sport. Muraoka went to the timber details. He was young and strong, and it was easier than thinking. He said afterward that the thing that undid him was not the pay or the food, but a guard named Tomczak from Milwaukee who taught him to swear in Polish, and who, at some point during that spring, showed him a photograph of his own kid brother, who was in the Pacific, who might very well have been shooting at Japanese sailors on the day the two of them were standing there in the snow. Tomczak showed it to him anyway. Muraoka said he never understood that as long as he lived. Meanwhile, the men had a second problem, and it was the one Arakawa spent his nights on. They were alive. Alive was not permitted. Every one of them had been raised to understand that a captured soldier had forfeited his place in the world. Some of them handled it by deciding they were already dead, and this was simply the interval. Some tried to make it true. There were prisoners in American camps who attempted suicide, and the guards learned to watch for it. And the officers wrote memoranda about it in the flat language of officers, and the men who were stopped were often furious about being stopped. The most famous of them was already there. Kazuo Sakamaki had been an ensign in the Imperial Japanese Navy, in command of a midget submarine, on the morning of December 7, 1941. His gyro compass failed. His boat ran aground. He washed up unconscious on a beach on Oahu, and was taken into custody by an American sergeant, and in that moment he became prisoner of war number 1, the first Japanese serviceman captured by the United States in the entire war. He asked to be allowed to kill himself. He asked more than once, and formally. The request was refused, and it was refused in a way that must have been maddening, which is that the Americans treated it as a medical concern rather than a matter of honor. Sakamaki spent much of the war at Camp McCoy. He went through the same thing everybody else did, in slower motion and at greater depth, and what came out the other end was a man who had rebuilt his idea of what a life was from the ground up. He wrote a memoir about it afterward. He went into business, worked for Toyota, ended up running their operation in Brazil, and lived until 1999. For decades he would not talk publicly about the submarine. When he finally did, at a conference in Texas in the 1990s where his boat was on display, he wept. Number 1. The first man to fail the test everyone had been given, and he outlived the empire that set it by 54 years. There is one more thing about Camp McCoy that I have never seen given the weight it deserves. In the summer of 1942, before most of these prisoners arrived, another unit was training on that same ground. The 100th Infantry Battalion. Roughly 1,400 Japanese-American soldiers, most of them from Hawaii, sent to Wisconsin to train, while their government argued internally about whether men who looked like the enemy could be trusted to carry rifles. They trained at Camp McCoy through the winter of 1942 and into 1943, and then went to Mississippi, and then to Italy, where the 100th took casualties at a rate that got it a nickname nobody wanted. It was later folded into the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which finished the war as the most decorated unit of its size in American history. So on that patch of Wisconsin, within about a year of each other, you had Japanese-American soldiers in American uniform preparing to die for a country that had locked up their families, and Japanese soldiers behind wire being fed by that same country according to a rule it had signed in 1929. The same faces on both sides of the fence, both groups being asked to prove something, in the same cold, on the same sand. Nobody planned that. History is not that literary. But it happened, and it happened there, and I think about it a lot. Through 1944, the camp settled into something that would have looked, from the air, almost domestic. There was a camp newspaper produced by the prisoners. There were classes, because among 200 men you will always find teachers, and among these men there were engineers and schoolmasters and at least one professor of literature. English lessons were popular, at first for practical reasons and later for reasons the students would have had difficulty explaining. There was a baseball team, which is not surprising when you remember that baseball had been played in Japan since the 1870s, and that some of these men had grown up in the stands. And there was the mail. This is where the story turns hard, and it is where I want to be careful, because the mail is the part everybody assumes was the happy ending, and it was not. Under the convention, prisoners were entitled to write home. The mechanism was the International Committee of the Red Cross, working through neutral Switzerland, on standardized forms with a strict word limit, read by censors on both ends, taking months to arrive if they arrived. It was slow, and it was thin, and it was better than nothing. Camp McCoy set it up. Forms were distributed. Shiraishi and the other interpreters explained the rules, and then they stood there while a large number of the prisoners declined to write. Not out of defiance, out of love, as those men understood it. If a letter arrived in a small town in Japan bearing a living man's name and the words prisoner of war, that town would know within a day. The family would receive visitors. The wife would be looked at in a particular way at the market. The children would hear about it at school, and in 1944 in Japan, children heard about things at school in a manner that left marks. Set against that, a lot of these men decided their families were better off with the telegram they had probably already received. Better a hero at the bottom of the ocean than a living disgrace in Wisconsin. That was not martyrdom. In their arithmetic, it was the kinder outcome, and they did the arithmetic carefully. Arakawa wrote. He agonized over it, and he wrote. Because he had a daughter, and he decided that the truth was owed to her even if it cost her mother something. 25 words, in pencil, on a Red Cross form. He was alive. He was well. He was being treated correctly. He thought of them. Muraoka did not write. He went back to the barracks and told himself again that his mother would keep the version of him she had. Multiply that decision across the camps. Then remember the false names, the men on the rolls who never existed, the men who existed and are on no roll at all. What you are left with, in the records, is a set of documents with holes shaped like people. That is not a Japanese problem, by the way. It is what happens to every war after the shooting stops. The paperwork survives and the explanation does not. If you have ever tried to work out what your own grandfather actually did between 1941 and 1945, and run into a wall built out of one photograph, a name, and a box of objects nobody ever explained, I wrote something for that. It is called Find Your Grandfather's War, and it walks through which American service records survived, where they are held, and how to read a man's war back out of them. The link is in the description. The end came fast, and it came in through the radio. The prisoners at Camp McCoy were not kept ignorant. They read newspapers. They knew about the Marianas, about the Philippines, about Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They knew the shape of the thing long before it finished. And by the spring of 1945, the mood in the barracks had gone somewhere the guards could not follow, because the news was no longer about the war. It was about the cities. It was about home. In March of 1945, the fire raids on Tokyo killed something on the order of 100,000 people in a single night. Men in that camp had families in Tokyo. They had families in Osaka, in Kobe, in Nagoya, in a long list of places that were being systematically taken apart, and they read about it in English-language newspapers in a heated barracks in Wisconsin, over rice. Muraoka's home was on the Izu coast, a fishing town, not a target. He read the reports anyway and could not stop. Arakawa wrote in a notebook that year, in a line that has been quoted a good deal since, that he had never before understood that a man could be ashamed of being warm. Then August. Hiroshima on the 6th, Nagasaki on the 9th. The details came through in pieces, and none of the pieces made sense. One aircraft, one bomb, a city. Prisoners with family in either place spent the following days in a condition the American staff had no procedure for. Captain Dahlgren, by several accounts, did the only thing available to him, which was to go around the barracks and say, badly, through an interpreter, that he was sorry, and that they would find out what could be found out. On the 15th of August, the men were assembled and told that Japan had accepted the terms of surrender, and that the Emperor himself had broadcast it. I would like to be able to describe that scene as relief. It was not relief. Some wept. Some refused to believe it and had to be shown the newspapers, and some refused to believe the newspapers. A few insisted it was a fabrication designed to break them, which, after 4 years of learning to distrust every kind word, was not a foolish thing to think. Others sat with the fact that everything they had been asked to die for had been spent, and had bought nothing, and that they had been fed white rice through all of it. And underneath all of it was the question none of them said out loud, which was, what happens to men like us now? Because the whole architecture of shame they had been living in assumed a Japan that had won, or at least a Japan that still believed what it had believed. Nobody had told them what a prisoner was supposed to be in a country that had lost. They started going home in the autumn and through 1946. The reception they had feared, by and large, did not happen. There was some of it. There were families who did not want the returning man in the house, and there were men who kept their war to themselves for the rest of their lives rather than explain the gap in it. But the country they came back to was not the one they had left. It was flattened, hungry, and occupied, and it had lost the appetite for punishing men over a code that had killed a great many of its sons for nothing. There was too much to do. A returning prisoner was, mostly, a pair of hands. Arakawa got back to a town north of Sendai in the winter of 1946, and found his wife and his daughter alive, in a house with a hole in the roof, on a diet of barley and radish. His daughter was 10 and did not know him. His wife had received the 25-word Red Cross form 11 months after he wrote it, and had told exactly 2 people about it, and had spent that time being congratulated on her husband's heroic death by people she could not correct. She kept the form. Her daughter still had it in the 1990s. He told them about the camp over the following months in small pieces, because it was too strange to deliver at once. He got to the part about the rice, and about 180 men sitting down to be executed over dinner, and his wife put down what she was holding and asked him to say the amount again. Not the story. The amount. How much rice? How often? Every day, he said. 3 times. She had been feeding a child on a ration that arrived as barley and sweet potato vine, in a country that grew rice, while her husband was eating polished white rice in an enemy prison camp in the American Midwest. He said he watched her try to make that fit and fail, and that he never once, in the years afterward, found a good way to say it that did not sound like a boast or an insult. That is the ugly little edge on this story that the sentimental versions leave out. Camp McCoy was not just better than the men expected. For long stretches, it was better than home, better than the front, better than the ration in Yokohama, and immeasurably better than the jungle. Being the enemy's prisoner had been, in raw physical terms, the safest thing that happened to any of them during the war, and living with that took some of these men the rest of their lives. Muraoka went back to the Izu coast and to fishing. His mother had, in fact, been told he was dead. He walked up from the harbor road in a borrowed jacket, and she dropped a pan. He did not talk about the camp for 40 years. Then, in the 1980s, a local historian started collecting accounts from men of his generation, and he sat down and told all of it, and the part he kept circling back to was not the rice and not the timber detail. It was Tomsack from Milwaukee showing him a picture of his kid brother in the Pacific. He said he had spent 4 decades trying to work out what that was, and had settled on the idea that it was a man refusing to do the arithmetic that everyone else was doing. Sakamaki, prisoner number 1, went home, was quietly received, went to work, and built a career. Shiraishi, the interpreter, was demobilized and went back to California, where his mother and sisters had come out of the Wyoming camp with about what they had gone in with. He did not talk about his war either. His children found out what he had done during it from a form letter in a drawer. Walter Bemis went back to Eau Claire and cooked in a restaurant, and told the rice story at parties for the rest of his life, and by all accounts about half the people who heard it thought he was making it up. Camp McCoy is Fort McCoy now, still an active installation. There is a preserved section on the post with restored wartime buildings, and the story of what happened there is kept up, both the prisoners and the 100th Infantry Battalion training in the snow. Here is what I keep coming back to. Everything those men believed about Americans was false, and none of it was stupid. Given what they had been told by people they had every reason to trust, the last meal reading of that plate of rice was not paranoia. It was competent analysis of bad data. That is the uncomfortable part. They were not fools. They were well informed about a world that did not exist. And what corrected them was not argument. Nobody talked them out of it. Dahlgren stood up in that mess hall and told them the plain truth in plain words, and it did not move a single man in the room, because that is not how a belief that deep comes apart. What moved them was breakfast. And the next breakfast. And a guard with a photograph. And a surgeon who took out an appendix at 3 a.m. without being asked twice. Weeks and months of small ordinary facts, arriving on schedule, refusing to behave the way the story required. Propaganda can survive an argument. It has trouble surviving a Tuesday. The other thing, and then I will let you go. Every decent thing that happened at Camp McCoy happened because a rule existed, and men followed it when there was no particular reason to. The people enforcing that rule were angry and grieving and reading casualty lists with names they knew on them, and the men they were feeding belonged to the army that had produced Bataan. Nobody in Wisconsin felt generous. They fed them properly anyway, because that was the standard, and standards are what you have for the days when you do not feel like it. That is not a warm story about human nature. It is a story about the machinery we build, precisely because human nature cannot be relied on, and I think it is the more useful lesson of the two. 180 men sat down to die in a mess hall in Wisconsin in the winter of 1944, and instead they had dinner, and then they had it again the next day, and it took about 4 years and the end of an empire for some of them to work out what had actually been served to them. If this one got to you, tell me in the comments which moment landed hardest, because I genuinely never know with these. And if you want more of the ones that never made it into the textbooks, there are plenty more where this came from.